on, everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Fedex St Jude Championship. Going to cover everything you need to know about this week's venue. We're going to cover some of the course specifics, a hole-by-hole breakdown of TPC Southwind, hop into some of the key stats for analysis, the types of metrics I'm using to identify my top plays of the week, and then we'll go ahead and finish it off with some of my comp courses, a few of the other similar tracks around the PGA Tour that you can look at both from a finishing position perspective and of course at the shots gained to try and get a little bit of an edge from your betting or for your DFS lineups. We are recording this here on a Sunday just after last tournaments ended and of course the whole season, right? A lot of storylines there with people that were on the bubble. Of course, Joo Kim, the biggest storyline of all, started with the quad bogey. Really had me worried because I had him in half my lineups this week. Now, I didn't bet him outright. I knew a few people that did. So first off, hats off to you if you were able to do so. But really feel, solid for the guy, but also a little bit heartbroken for guys like an Austin Smotherman, right? Who obviously missed the cut there in very, I should say, public fashion there on a Saturday morning. On top of that, guys like Matt Wallace, who were kicked out of the top 125 because of Joo Kim's win. Just, a lot of heartbreak, but of course, on the flip side, plenty of guys that were able to get their cards, were able to secure their job for next year, so plenty of positive storylines too. In terms of our betting lines, ended up doing pretty decent, especially from the top 5, top 10 perspective. Our DFS lineups were really close there, had a lineup in the top 3 for some time in the large field GPP, still ended up 4x over there, and on prize picks, made over $3,000 on the week, so really no complaints for that side. Just a lot of wins pretty much across the board, and at a course like Sedgefield, where we have all that data, it is so consistent from year to year. That's what we can expect, and TPC Southwind is that exact same venue. It's, a par 70, so it has that going for it, but also extremely predictive course history and a really distinct skill set for success. So we'll definitely touch on what that skill set is, but over the years, the winners pretty much all have that same type of build. And in terms of the top 5, top 10 finishers, you'll see that same type of trend. So really excited to hop into it, going to cover everything you guys need to know. Let's go ahead, quick babbling about last week, and go ahead and hop on in. We're heading down to Memphis. We've got ourselves TPC Southwind, and this time of year, it's always known for its heat. You always hear about how hot it is at this event, how the caddies are going to have 6 or 7 towels just to get the sweat off of their players, make sure there's no moisture on their grips. That's a legitimate factor this sort of year. And also, just something I want to mention, conditioning. Players' ability to go out there, withstand these conditions may end up being a factor, particularly for those that make it to the weekend. On top of that, we've got ourselves a Ron Pritchard design, which is, not a prominent designer, not one we see all that often on the PGA Tour, but nonetheless, in a very unique track. It's going to bring a lot of excitement to the table, much like a TPC Twin Cities, another TPC network design. It has plenty of water in play and plenty of holes where that risk-reward factor really comes into play. So from an architecture standpoint, even though he's not one of those big 3 designers that we're used to seeing like a Pete Dye, of course, a lot of the other prominent designers like a Jack Nicklaus we see quite often, he's going to be somebody who is just on that same level, maybe doesn't have the same type of name recognition. So I love this golf course. Over the years, you've seen more water balls at TPC Southwind than any other golf course, more years than any other venue. Now it changes from year to year. TPC Twin Cities is going to be up there this year, but if you're going to get firm and fast conditions or windy conditions around this track, you could see absolute chaos. So from the entertainment perspective, like I was mentioning, it brings a lot to the table because you can see massive swings on the leaderboard. In terms of some of the specifics, just trying to make sure we're on the same page here. It is a par 70. Last year played to an average of 69.05, so right around 0.95 shots under par. In terms of penalty strokes per round, so with all of that water in play, there were 0.64 penalty strokes per round. So over a 4-round sample size, nearly 2.5, actually a little bit over 2.5 penalty strokes. That is 0.23 more than average per round, which is quite significant. Again, 0.23 doesn't seem like all that much in the grand scheme of things, but like I mentioned, you're going to see plenty of blowups around this venue, which makes it especially entertaining. The scorecard yardage is 7,243 yards. Now on Data Golf, they take into consideration a lot of the dog legs where players are hitting their balls on average, and the average actual length or effective length of this golf course was closer to 7,100 yards, which is very much so on par with what we saw for this week at the Wyndham Championship. So though it's a par 70, it's listed at closer to like 7,200, maybe even closer to 7,300 yards if they add a little bit of length. It's not going to play nearly as long. A lot of it can be taken off with dog legs, which a majority of the players in the field, especially since it's a playoff event, will be able to do. In terms of sand bunkers, there are 75 on property. In terms of water in play, there's in play on 11 holes, which we'll talk about extensively when we go by the hole-by-hole breakdown. The greens here are tiny, very similar to what we see at a Pebble Beach, where they're right around 4,300 square foot per green. So small targets out there, and we'll talk about the weather here in a minute. It's going to be extremely firm and fast out there, which is going to make them extremely difficult to hit. So last year, they were hit at a 68.4% clip, which was 0.2% more than tour average, so pretty much right at what we'd expect week to week on tour. I'd expect it to perhaps be a little bit more difficult this year. So maybe a little bit closer to, 2/3 of the greens being hit. So a little bit lower than what we're used to seeing on tour. Definitely with how small they are, they're at 4,300 square foot, adds a little bit of difficulty there. They'll be running at 12 to 12.5. Now, might even be 12.5 to 13 by the weekend with, again, some of the weather that we'll talk about here in a second, but it's been extremely dry in the area, and we are putting on champion Bermuda grass. So very similar to what we saw at Sedgefield Country Club for the Wyndham. Going to be Bermuda grass, which is the first time we've seen the surface for quite some time. It tends to be extremely predictive. Guys that putt well on Bermuda tend to have a lot of lasting success on the surface. So definitely something to consider when we get to the putting stats, which we'll talk about again extensively in the key stats section. Fairways are 29.6 yards wide, so they're actually just slightly wider than what we had at the Wyndham Championship, but definitely towards the narrow end of the spectrum. And as a result, the fairways were only hit at a 66.6% rate, which is 0.6% more than the tour average. And the thing to consider here is that people lay up on most of the tee boxes here. The average driving distance around this venue is well below the tour average, and that is despite having one of the longer fields. A lot of the Bombers, playoff-bound players in the field, it has one of the lower driving distance rates. So that is mostly caused by a lot of players laying up. So it is a surprise to see that the average fairway percentage is just 66.6%, which again is just 0.6% more than the tour average. They are a zoysia grass surface, which we are going to talk about this effect a little bit more later on. It tends to be a little bit unique. When you're hitting off zoysia, it's like hitting off of a carpet, a practice mat, like I'm sure you guys have done plenty of times in your life. And as a result, you're able to apply a little bit more spin to your shots. So players that have the familiarity on that surface or just a knack for doing so are guys that you might want to take a look at. And there's not a huge sample size. I think there's only 3 or 4 courses on the entire PGA Tour schedule that have a zoysia grass fairway. But when we're able to pull stats from some of those golf courses, might be a few guys who are able to identify out of the field that have had just relative or sustained success there on zoysia. The rough is a 2.5-inch Bermuda grass rough, so very similar to what we saw at Sedgefield, which doesn't seem all that penal. Again, we saw 3.5, 4-inch bent grass, bluegrass around a lot of other golf courses. You have to remember that Bermuda grass is a little bit more sticky, and 2.5-inch Bermuda grass is arguably even more penal than something like 4-inch bent grass. And the stats completely back that up. The missed fairway penalty was 0.45 strokes. So every time you missed a fairway is right around a half-stroke penalty, which was almost a tenth of a stroke higher than the tour average. In terms of the weather, this is what's important here. So, all of these metrics, slightly higher than average, or right around tour average. I expect it to play a little bit more difficult this year because of the quote-unquote extreme drought. And this is what a lot of weather sources are telling me about the area, that this area of the country has been in. Memphis this time of year is notoriously hot. And a lot of times it's also, not very humid. You're dealing with extremely dry conditions. And over the last 2 months, it has rained 5 inches less than normal. And it's already not raining very much in the area. So you're talking about extremely firm, extremely fast greens out there. The fairways are going to be fiery. So even when players are laying up off the tee, they could realistically get 20, 30, 35 extra yards of rollout, a little bit more if they're hitting stingers into greens. They're going to have to play the ball maybe 10, 15 feet short, even with wedges, because of the extra release you're going to get. it's going to play even more difficult this time around. So in the past, you have winners like DJ, for example, that took it to 19 under par. We've also seen winners closer to 10 under par over the years around this track. You're going to see the more difficult version of this event. So just keep that in mind. The weather has been extremely dry in the Memphis area over the last months there in June and July. So something I am definitely keeping in consideration with my projections, particularly when we get to the key stats. Alrighty, on the screen, we've got the Pro Visualizer tool, and we're going to do our hole-by-hole breakdown here a little bit quicker than usual. So just a quick look at some of the holes here. And here with hole number 1, you get an idea of what to expect here. So 429 yards. You can see the tee shot, there is a little bit of water to the left, so technically in play, but shouldn't be for most players unless it's a complete mishit. And it's not the hardest hole. They do give you quite a bit of a handshake here, but don't get used to that. There are going to be quite a few tricky holes, quite a few tricky pin locations to worry about. Hole number 2 is 393 yards. You can see it's on the shorter end of the spectrum. Another dog leg, so there in hole number 1, a dog leg to the left. Hole number 1, a dog leg to the right. You quickly, first off, see how narrow the fairways are, but second off, the amount of shot making that is needed. You can't be somebody that just consistently hits a right to left ball flight or somebody that hits that left to right ball flight, because you're going to get into trouble when you get into some of these dog legs. Hole number 3 is 568 yards, so it's definitely reachable by the entire field. You're going to see most players take a crack at this in 2. You pretty much don't have to lay up here. I mean, you can see Pro Visualizer, expecting amateurs to play here, has the layup zone over here. You definitely have to take the water into consideration, but if you're in the fairway, most players will take a hack at it. I'd expect most to bail out to the left, if anything. If you end up, let's say, over slicing it, starting at left, slicing it onto the pin, and overdoing it a little bit, maybe you end up where the pin is if it's in the middle of the green, right? If you end up just hitting it the straight ball, which a lot of players will probably do when bailing out, end up in a pretty simple up and down zone, which makes number 3 one of the easier holes on the golf course. Hole 4 is 194 yards. It's a par 3. It's relatively straightforward. Now, it's a tiny green, so I'll show you the green surface here. You have the water to the left, which isn't in play unless you completely mishit it. They will put a pin location to the back left, which can make it a little bit dicey, but anything else on the green pretty much takes the water out of play. The real key here is just holding the surface. I mean, look how thin it is. You can see it's almost a boomerang shape there, which makes it a little bit tricky, but it's only 192 yards. Certainly gettable by the entire field if they hit a good shot. Next up, we've got another par 5. I believe this one actually may be converted to a par 4 if memory serves me correctly. So it plays closer to like 500 yards and it's a par 4. So don't look at this as a par 5 like it shows on here. So it plays a little bit more difficult, but with the tee boxes moved up a little bit, should still be more than manageable for the entire field. Next up, we've got a par 4. It's 444 yards. It's a dog leg to the left, so a right to left ball flight is what is preferred around hole number 6. Another gettable hole, but another small green. And you can see here, if they put the pin, the greens have plenty of undulation around TPC Southwind. They can be tricky up and downs, right? A middle left pin here doesn't look all that bad when you're on a pin sheet. But if you're in this left bunker, you have no chance of getting up and down. The green slopes from left to right on the left side, slopes from right to left on the right side. They're almost like bowls, which helps you when you're hitting your iron shots, right? If you're just a little bit off, it'll keep your ball on the green. But when you miss the greens, it's absolute hell. So at this golf course, we're going to talk about the key stats as soon as we finish this section. It's why ball striking is so important, right? When you miss, you're going to be penalized heavily. So shots gained around the green is also important here, but not missing in the first place is the absolute key, because if you just hardly miss, if you're somebody whose misses are manageable, you're going to absolutely get bailed out for them. You're going to get that effect of that bowl there. So hole number 6 is a great example of that, but that same characteristic is found at most holes around this track. Hole number 7 is 477, so it's on the longer end of the spectrum. Definitely going to have a mid-iron at the very least into this green, but one of the larger greens, so it's not all that bad. Hole 8 is 170 yards. It's a par 3, and look how small that is. I mean, it looks like a thimble out there. When I said these greens were tiny, I wasn't kidding. They look like Pebble Beach greens. It's 170 yards, so it's not all that bad. If it was 240 yards, good luck trying to hit that thing in regulation. Make sure you hit the green, because all of these bunkers are going to leave up and downs, particularly if the pin is tucked right in front of them. You can see, they're going to use a back right pin location. That bunker would be extremely hard to get up and down out of. Front left would make that one really hard. You get the point around the clock right there. It's a fun golf course. That's why TPC Southwind is a ball striker's paradise, because just keep yourself out of those situations to begin with. I think that's really the theme to, write home about here. Next up, we've got a dogleg right. It's a par 4, 456 yards. The water not really in play off the tee, but sure as heck going to be in play on the second shot. So, you're hitting over water. A front left pin location, a front right pin location can be extremely dicey. Now, if they put it in the back, it's not home free either. These bunkers, you're going to have a downhill shot onto the green out of them, which makes getting up and down nearly impossible. Now heading on to the back nine, hole 10 is 456. It's a dog leg to the left, but it's kind of a soft dog leg, not as severe as some of the other ones on property. You do have a water in play, but for the tee shot, most players will just lay up here with a 3-wood, completely take it out of play, and it's not really the hardest hole. So if you have guys that are starting on hole 10, hole number 1 is definitely a handshake. I would prefer that all day. It's just 430 yards. This one's only 450 yards though, so another quote-unquote handshake. The thing is, hole number 11, the easiest hole on property, but also one you can get into trouble on. So you'll see plenty of birdies here at hole number 11, but also plenty of double bogeys. Frankly, it's pretty obvious why you have an island green here, plenty of water in play. Getting up and down from the bunkers is also no easy feat. And at this course, 75 bunkers, like I mentioned before, there are a ton of them that you can end up in, and all of them are almost equally as penal, especially some of the fairway bunkers. They have steeper faces than what we're used to seeing here in the United States. Hole number 12 is 406 yards. This tee shot is the hardest on property. It's a left to right dog leg. You have the water on the right side. So, it calls for that left to right shape, but then you got the water on the right side. You have all these fairway bunkers down the left side. So the guys that aim left, hit that slice, but then bail out because they're scared of the water are going to end up in these bunkers. And then, even though it's only a wedge, if you end up in one of these fairway bunkers, especially like this front one right here, you still kind of got the water in play. It's close enough where if you mishit it, you block it out to the right, you're going to be dropping here in the fairway, hitting 4 into the green, trying to save double bogey at that point. It's a hole that you can certainly birdie if you get it out there in the fairway, but also one that can come up and grab you. Hole 13 is 468 yards. It's a dogleg from left to right. It's relatively gettable, but another just small green, right? Don't miss the target. Get it on the surface there and 2-putt. Hole 14 is the longest par 3 on property. It's also probably the most difficult hole because you have the water down the right side, at a distance of 230 yards, also not the largest green. This is just nightmare fuel. You're going to see a ton of players end up short and to the left. You're going to see plenty of them that try and go for the green and end up in the bunker here to the front left of the green. It's just a tough situation all around. The ball strikers, this is why they tend to succeed here. You put them on a 230-yard par 3 with water in play, the best ball strikers are going to shine. The guys that are a little bit dicey, don't have that confidence, are going to be the ones that end up drowning. Next up, we've got a 394-yard par 4, so relatively straightforward dogleg from right to left. You do have water in play on the second shot, but unless it's a front left pin location or a back right pin location, shouldn't be all that worrisome. The pin location towards the back left here, which they'll use quite often, is definitely gettable. So when they use that, definitely expect to see a little bit easier scoring here, but definitely a tough one when it's over here on the right side or, the front right where it brings the canal there into play. Hole 16 is 530 yards. I don't know if this one's a par 5 or a par 4, so don't quote me on it, but it's reachable by anyone in 2 if it is a par 5. I believe it is a par 4 though. So yeah, it's relatively gettable. Funky shaped green here. You can see it's like an hourglass shape right there. But should be gettable in 2 by everyone, even if it is the par 5. But I believe it might be a par 4. Next up, we've got hole 17. It is 487 yards. It's one of the longer par 4s on property. So definitely, it's a driver hole if there is one around TPC Southwind. There's no water in play. There's no water in play into the green. So unlike TPC Twin Cities, where we have all of that water in play from hole 16 in, a little bit less here around TPC Southwind, right? Hole 17, you don't have to worry about the water all that much. And hole number 18, you got the water back again. So yeah, actually hole 16 is a par 5. It's just extremely short. It's the one on the front 9 that I mentioned that is the par 4. Yeah, that last one definitely is a par 5. But hole 18, this is an absolute brute of a tee shot. There are plenty of lookalikes, plenty of recreations of this hole that I've played down here in Florida, where you have this huge lake down the left side. It's a huge dog lake from right to left. This is a tough hole because much like some of the other tee shots where the water will make players try to aim it right, maybe draw it onto the fairway, a lot of them will just get scared. They'll bail out, they'll hit the straight ball outright, end up in one of these fairway bunkers, and while the water doesn't come into play nearly as much, a fairway bunker shot from like 160, 170 yards, especially with how steep some of the fairway bunker faces are here, can be a risky proposition, particularly if you end up coming over the top, hitting it left. Then you can end up in real trouble, hitting shot number 4 into the green. So hole 18, a great finishing hole, particularly from the driving perspective. Going to see plenty of players crumble under pressure. Alrighty, now that we've seen the golf course hole by hole, let's talk about some of the stats that I'm using to identify my top plays this week. So at the top, you probably got this idea from the breakdown, but shots gained approach. This is a ball striker's paradise. Just think about the winners: Abraham Ancer, Justin Thomas, a Brooks Koepka, somebody like a Dustin Johnson. All of those players, elite level ball strikers. And it's no surprise, given how small the greens are, all of the water in play, the people that can keep themselves out of that trouble are the ones that are going to have success. So that is certainly the number one thing I'm looking at. It is the number one correlated course on tour when it comes to success with shots gained approach stats. It's also a mid-iron type of golf course. So you could see there were a few shorter holes that were closer to 400 yards. A lot of those required a layup off the tee though. So despite it only being 7,200 yards, only playing closer to 7,100 yards in terms of its effective yardage, you're going to see plenty of mid-irons drawn. Now that 125 to 150 range, the 150 to 175, and lastly, the 175 to 200 yard range are going to be extremely overutilized this week. So when I'm doing some of my modeling, when I'm taking a look at some of the proximity buckets, I am certainly going to be overweighing those 3 buckets a little bit more than the rest of the bunch. At number 2, we have shots gained putting, and specifically on Bermuda grass. So once again, we are back on Bermuda, which, as I mentioned last week and towards the beginning of this video, is one of the most predictive surfaces. When we get on Bermuda, it's something that I factor even more so than when we're on POA or something like bent grass. With the effect of grain, the guys that tend to have a lot of success on Bermuda tend to have a lot of sustained success on it, and while the guys that struggle on it usually tend to struggle over time. They usually don't figure it out over time. It's something you're either born with, you grew up on Bermuda and have a lot of familiarity with it, or you don't. And that's what you see with a lot of players on average. So that's definitely something I'm looking at. Also, in terms of the off the tee play, it's a little bit de-emphasized with how many players have to lay up off the tee, how many times driver is taken out of their hands. So as a result, stats like approach play obviously get a little bit more important, but also stats like shots gained putting. Next up, we've got shots gained around the green, which hardly ever ends up surfacing on a golf course. When we're doing these course breakdowns, shots gained around the green is usually like number 9 or number 10 when it comes to importance. But around this track, TPC Southwind, I talked about just how difficult some of the bunker shots are. So sand saves are going to be an extra stat to look at. We'll talk about that here in a second. But more importantly, these Georgia grass fairways are extremely hard to get up and down on, but also that Bermuda grass rough. Everything at this golf course, the undulation on the greens, how firm and fast it is, the Georgia, the Bermuda that we talked about, just adds difficulty to around the green. So every shot when you miss a green around here has the utmost highest difficulty. Now, if you're somebody who's short-sighted, good luck. You're going to pretty much get up and down 1 out of 10 times, maybe 1 out of 100 times in some situations at their very best. And even when you have an uphill chip, you have everything going for you, you're still going to be dealing with all of the extra intricacies of either Georgia or Bermuda grass rough. That is just something that you don't want to deal with. So players that are solid around the green, that have had success at this golf course, also other golf courses like Pebble Beach where you have these Georgia fairways, are going to be stats that I'm weighing relatively heavily this week. So when we get to the comp courses, a few of those tracks have a similar setup where around the green it's extremely difficult. Also just in general, the players that are better around the green are going to be better equipped for those situations. In terms of some of the extra key stats I'm looking at, birdie or better percentage is important, which may not seem to be the case with a winning score there between 10 and maybe 16, 17 under par at the very max. But just like a TPC Twin Cities, the winning score might not reflect how many birdies are made. It's It's a golf course where you have to be aggressive, but when you're hitting fairways and you're hitting greens, you could take it nuclear low. I mean, there's plenty of large scores to be had out there, but if you're going out there and having flawless golf from tee to green, it is not going to be an issue. So birdie or better percentage is a way to try and encapsulate some of that aggressiveness. You also got driving accuracy, which is going to clearly be important at a golf course with all this water off the tee. Taking a look at par 4 scoring for a par 70 setup, shots gained on fast greens with the expected firm and fast conditions with the weather we've seen of late. Taking a look at sand save percentage, like I mentioned with the 75 bunkers on property. Driving distance is in the model, but it's towards the bottom, so not nearly as important as most weeks. Shots gained on firm and fast conditions are also a stat that I'm looking at. Next up, we've got shots gained on comp courses, which we'll talk about here in a second what those three are. Shots gained at TPC Southwind, as I mentioned, quite prominent course history here. It's been relatively predictive over the years. We've had plenty of guys like a Brooks Koepka who have had sustained success around TPC Southwind, so that is something that I'm incorporating. And also, shots gained approach off of Georgia. Just like around the green play, the approach shots off of Georgia tend to be a little bit unique. Like I said, a little bit more spinny than some golf shots. So definitely something that I'm also just adding a little bit of sprinkle of to my model this week. All right, and now for our comp courses. At number 1, we have the Copperhead course at Innisbrook, the home of the Valspar Championship, a golf course where ball striking is the absolute key. Now, while it might be a little bit longer, off the tee might be a little bit more important around Copperhead, you have a huge emphasis on approach play, but also with the putter and on Bermuda grass. So a lot of the players that we'd be targeting around in Innisbrook are also the type of players we'd be targeting around here. So I think looking at the leaderboards from some of the past years around Innisbrook, taking a look at some of the shots gained metrics around that track could be a little bit useful this week. So in terms of shots gained in Innisbrook, that is something that I'll be including because like I said, just the guys that we'd be targeting for that golf tournament are going to be the type of guys that we'd be targeting this week. So I think it's worth taking a few looks at. The Bermuda grass specialty just adds a little bit of an extra cherry on top when it comes to the fit. Next up, we've got Pebble Beach Golf Links. I talked about it as a comp a little bit earlier, but you've got tiny greens around Pebble Beach. On top of that, you've got difficult around the green shots, a similar emphasis on driving accuracy, but also approach play. So guys that are just more precision guys more than anything. Same thing with Sedgefield Country Club, right? Pretty similar type of skill set are the exact type of guys that we're looking for. So while it's a POA, it's on the West Coast, a lot of the agronomy isn't the same. You're looking at a lot of similarities when it comes to the skill set. And if memory serves me correctly, you have Georgia fairways around that track. So, one of the few tracks around the PGA Tour that I'm pretty sure that we can get those sample size from. So definitely something that I'm using in my analysis. And lastly, we've got TPC Twin Cities. So I've talked about it plenty of times, how all of the water in play makes it extremely volatile. And there are also plenty of birdie looks out there. TPC Twin Cities fits that same mold. So while I think the winning score might be a little bit lower here, and by lower, I mean like closer to like 10 under par rather than 20 under par like you'd see at a TPC Twin Cities, I think that from a skill set perspective, again, just trying to identify the top plays, we're trying to identify those type of players. The ones that can be aggressive, go out there, make birdies, keep themselves out of trouble off the tee, are going to also have success around TPC Southwind. And it's also just a little bit useful that it's this time of year. We can take some of the shots gained metrics from something that hasn't happened all that long ago, right? Pebble Beach happened, ancient, just years ago at this point, right? Innisbrook, right? Towards the spring, years ago at this point. And I was at that event. Feels like it was last year at this point. I like looking at something like the 3M Open because it has happened in the last few months. So those are the top 3 comps that I'm looking at. If you're trying to find a few more, par 70s, par 71s that are less than like 72, 7,300 yards, probably things that you can include in your modeling. But just from a course fit perspective, these 3 check more boxes than most and why that I'm using them the most this week. Alrighty, that's all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, make sure you go ahead and smash that like button. It really helps me out a ton with growing the channel. But also, go ahead and comment what you think the winning score is going to be. I'll personally have to take 13 under par as my pick. But go ahead and let me know your prediction down there. As per usual, expect to see the usual dose of content this week. So there'll be our DFS picks that'll be dropping sometime tomorrow evening. We'll have fades and sleepers, value picks, a weekly live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're trying to get all of the content that I'm dropping this week from the betting and DFS side. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe to the channel as well. It's the best way to help me grow the channel too. It helps me get more exposure, but more importantly, it makes sure that you don't miss any of the content that I post in the future. So make sure you go ahead and do that if you haven't already. But like I said before, I'll catch you guys in the future for those videos. Best of luck for any of the outright bets that you're placing, any of the DFS lineups that you go ahead and decide to enter here, and let's go ahead and get that cash.